If you think pornography doesn't have a serious effect on the brain, think again. Emerging research has shown that regular consumption of porn isn't just a harmless hobby. It's a neurobiological experience that rewires how we think, feel, and behave. But the question is, how far does this impact go, and can it be undone? Pornography isn't just a quick fix for pleasure. It has a profound impact on how the brain functions. At the core of this effect is the brain's reward system, primarily driven by dopamine, the feel-good neurotransmitter. Every time a person experiences pleasure, dopamine floods the brain, creating a sense of satisfaction. This is why activities like eating, socializing, or, yes, watching porn feel so rewarding. However, the problem arises when this dopamine rush becomes too frequent. Over time, the brain starts to adapt to the constant highs. The result, the pleasure from watching porn no longer feels as intense, and the brain begins to crave more. More time spent watching, more extreme content, and stronger stimulation. This is the essence of addiction. The brain's reward center gets rewired, needing higher levels of dopamine to reach the same sense of satisfaction. But the impact goes deeper. Studies show that prolonged exposure to pornography changes brain structures, particularly in areas related to decision-making, impulse control, and moral judgment. MRI scans reveal that the gray matter in the brain, particularly in areas responsible for higher cognitive functions, shrinks in individuals who are addicted to porn. This reduction in gray matter impacts a person's ability to make sound decisions, weigh the consequences of their actions, and maintain self-control. In short, the more time someone spends watching porn, the more their ability to think critically and emotionally regulate begins to diminish. This isn't just a minor change. It's a fundamental shift in how the brain processes pleasure, behavior, and decision-making. What once might have been a simple indulgence now becomes a complex neurological issue, one that alters not just how you feel, but how you live your life. When it comes to the brain's development, age matters. The effects of pornography are not the same across the lifespan, especially when it comes to adolescence. During adolescence, the brain is still developing, particularly the areas responsible for emotional regulation, impulse control, and long-term decision-making. This makes teenagers far more vulnerable to the negative impacts of pornography than adults. For young people exposed to porn at an early age, the consequences can be long-lasting. Adolescents often lack the emotional maturity to process the sexual and emotional stimuli they encounter in porn. Their brains are still forming, and their understanding of sex and relationships is in its early stages. This leads to confusion, unrealistic expectations, and a distorted sense of intimacy. Adolescents may begin to associate sex with pleasure that is disconnected from emotional connection or mutual respect, which can skew their views on relationships and sexual behavior. Research has shown that early exposure to pornography can also disrupt sexual maturation and lead to problematic sexual behaviors later in life. It's not just about the content, but the frequency of exposure. The more often a young person engages with pornography, the greater the risk of developing unhealthy sexual behaviors or even addiction. This exposure can influence how they develop as individuals, affecting their sexual health, relationships, and even their self-esteem. But it's not only teens who are impacted. Adults are also affected, though perhaps in different ways. As individuals grow older, they have more developed coping mechanisms and decision-making skills, but the emotional and psychological effects of pornography consumption still linger. The brain's neural wiring changes as a result of exposure, regardless of age, and can lead to compulsive behavior, body image issues, and distorted views on intimacy. Ultimately, whether a person is young or mature, the age at which they are exposed to pornography plays a critical role in how it impacts their brain. The earlier the exposure, the greater the risk of long-term consequences, making it even more crucial for society to address the effects of pornography on younger generations. Men and women may both be drawn to pornography, but they engage with it for different reasons, and the impact on their brains can manifest in unique ways. However, when we look at the neurological effects, the changes in brain activity, especially in the reward system, are surprisingly similar across genders. Both men and women experience dopamine surges in response to sexual stimuli, which is why both groups develop patterns of consumption that can become addictive. But when we dig deeper, the emotional and psychological responses to pornography often differ. For men, pornography can primarily serve as a way to fulfill sexual desires quickly, often focusing on the immediate pleasure and visual stimulation. For many men, the consumption of pornography doesn't necessarily carry significant emotional weight, which can make it easier to fall into a habitual cycle of use without deeper psychological consequences. For women, the relationship with pornography is more complicated. Cultural stigmas surrounding female sexuality often make women feel ashamed of their interest in porn, which can create feelings of guilt or confusion. While some women may consume porn for pleasure or emotional connection, they may also be more likely to seek content that aligns with their emotional needs or relational fantasies, which can lead to different kinds of psychological impacts. Women are often socialized to view their sexual desires through a moral or cultural lens, which complicates their emotional relationship with pornography. This emotional conflict can be particularly damaging. For women, exposure to pornography may lead to feelings of shame, depression, and anxiety, especially in a society that often stigmatizes female sexual autonomy. These negative emotions can lead to a greater psychological burden compared to men, who may feel less societal pressure to conceal or repress their consumption. Yet, despite these differences, both men and women experience similar neurological consequences. Pornography addiction in either gender can lead to emotional dysregulation, impulsive behavior, and impaired decision-making. Both genders are at risk of objectification, reduced relationship satisfaction, and decreased empathy for partners. The long-term emotional and neurological effects are far from gender-specific. They affect both men and women in profound ways, altering their brains and their behaviors. In this light, it's clear that while the reasons for watching porn and the emotional responses to it may differ based on gender, the neurological impact is universal. The addiction to pornography can erode the ability to make sound decisions, affect emotional health, and distort one's perception of intimacy and relationships, regardless of whether the person is male or female. At first glance, many people associate watching pornography with positive emotions, excitement, arousal, and pleasure. It provides a quick escape from daily stress, a temporary thrill that feels rewarding. However, the emotional impact of pornography is far more complex than it appears on the surface. Over time, the emotional effects of porn consumption can spiral into a cycle of negative feelings, particularly when addiction takes hold. The initial pleasure of watching porn comes from the dopamine rush, which activates the brain's reward system. However, this high is short-lived, and it's followed by a crash, a decrease in dopamine levels that leaves individuals feeling empty, guilty, or ashamed. This cycle of highs and lows can lead to emotional dysregulation, where a person is no longer able to experience pleasure in other areas of life. Activities that once brought joy or satisfaction now seem dull and unremarkable in comparison to the quick rush of pornography. But the emotional consequences don't stop there. For many individuals, especially those struggling with porn addiction, the feelings of guilt and shame become overwhelming. Pornography consumption often leads to feelings of internal conflict, especially when the individual's actions don't align with their moral values or self-image. This internal battle can cause deep emotional distress, often leading to anxiety, depression, or feelings of worthlessness. The cycle of emotional highs and lows also contributes to the development of compulsive behavior. As the brain becomes conditioned to seek out more porn to replicate the initial high, individuals begin to feel trapped in a cycle of seeking pleasure and then feeling ashamed or guilty afterward. Over time, this emotional pattern reinforces the addiction, making it harder to break free. Additionally, emotional issues related to pornography addiction can spill over into relationships. Individuals may feel disconnected from their partners or unable to form intimate emotional connections. The shame and guilt from pornography use can create barriers to communication and emotional closeness, further complicating their relationships. In the end, the emotional impact of pornography isn't just about fleeting pleasure. It's about the long-term damage it does to emotional well-being. Addiction to porn erodes self-regulation, heightens negative emotions like guilt and shame, and fosters emotional disconnection, all of which contribute to a downward spiral of mental and emotional health. The more frequently a person turns to porn for emotional relief, the more they risk losing the ability to experience genuine pleasure and intimacy in their lives. Pornography addiction isn't just a fleeting habit. It's a serious issue that affects both the mind and body. From its neurological impact, altering brain structures and functions, to its emotional toll, creating cycles of shame, guilt, and emotional dysregulation, the consequences are far-reaching. For those who struggle with this addiction, the behavioral shifts can be just as damaging, leading to objectification, isolation, and a distorted view of intimacy. However, there is hope. Recovery from pornography addiction is possible, but it requires time, effort, and often professional help. By understanding the deep impact that porn has on the brain and the body, individuals can begin to take the necessary steps toward healing. Whether it's through therapy, medications, or holistic approaches, breaking free from the grip of addiction is achievable. While it may feel impossible at times, the road to recovery is one of self-awareness, rebuilding healthy brain functions, and finding meaningful connections that replace the need for the fleeting dopamine hits from porn. Understanding the true cost of pornography on both an emotional and neurological level is the first step in changing the narrative, and for many, it's the first step toward freedom.